The old train station in Yorkshire was like something out of a ghost story. The platform was crumbling, with weeds pushing through the cracks, and the cold, foggy night only added to the eerie atmosphere. Oliver stood there, frustrated and exhausted after missing the last train home. He rubbed his eyes, trying to ignore how the station felt frozen in time. The usual night sounds strangely absent. He told himself it was just his tired mind playing tricks, but a nagging unease crept in, reminding him how utterly alone he was in this forgotten place. Through the thick fog, a train suddenly emerged, a vintage steam engine that looked like it had stepped out of another century. Oliver stared in surprise, unease prickling at the back of his neck, but relief quickly followed. At least he wouldn't be stranded. The old-fashioned look was strange, sure, but he convinced himself it must be some special service he hadn't heard about. As he boarded, the antique interior struck him. The plush seats, wood-paneled walls, and dim, flickering lamps gave the carriage an eerie, time-worn charm. The other passengers were odd too, dressed in outdated clothing, their faces pale and emotionless. Oliver felt a pang of unease but pushed it aside, blaming his overactive imagination. As the train pulled away from the station, the atmosphere grew colder, the air heavy and damp. A thick silence filled the carriage, broken only by the occasional mournful whistle. Oliver tried to strike up a conversation with the nearest passenger, but the man didn't react, staring blankly ahead as if Oliver didn't exist. Uneasiness settled in, deepening with each passing moment. As the train sped into the night, the rhythmic clatter of the train was no longer comforting. It felt like a ticking clock counting down to something terrible. The windows began to fog up with a cold mist that seemed to seep into the carriage, chilling Oliver to the bone. Shadows flickered in the corners of his vision, moving in unnatural ways that made his skin crawl. The train was picking up speed, yet there was no sign of a destination, only the relentless forward motion into the unknown. A cold dread settled over Oliver as he began to notice the passengers around him. Their appearances were shifting, their skin growing pale and taut, revealing ghastly, decayed faces. Their eyes, once merely vacant, now looked hollow and lifeless, staring straight ahead with a chilling emptiness. It hit Oliver with a jolt. This was no ordinary train. These were no ordinary passengers. They were ghosts, trapped on this cursed train for eternity. And now he was too. The train wasn't taking him home. It was carrying him to a place far beyond the living world. Panic surged through him. He jumped up, rushing to the nearest door, but it was locked tight. The windows were sealed, offering no escape. The shadows around him deepened, the interior of the train growing darker and more oppressive. The other passengers, now fully transformed into terrifying apparitions, slowly turned their heads to face him, their cold, lifeless gazes locking onto him, trapping him in place as the train hurtled into the abyss. Panic gripped Oliver as he frantically pulled at the train's doors, but they wouldn't budge. His heart raced as the mournful whistle echoed through the carriage, a sound that seemed to resonate deep within him, filling him with dread. The other passengers, their ghastly faces now fully revealed, began to close in, their cold, skeletal hands reaching for him. Desperation turned to terror as he realized there was no escape. He was trapped. As the train barreled through the endless night, Oliver's body grew cold, his skin paling. Finally, he sank into a seat, his eyes blank and hollow, just like the others, as the last train disappeared into the fog, never to stop again. The old train station in rural Louisiana had seen better days. The wooden benches were worn and splintered, the faded signs barely legible, and the heavy, humid air hung thick around the platform. A few other passengers were scattered around, but the place felt almost deserted, adding to the eerie sense of isolation. The evening was creeping in, and the sky had begun to darken, casting long, eerie shadows across the platform. Casey sat on one of the benches, her foot tapping impatiently as she checked her watch again. The train was late. She was practical, independent, but the atmosphere was starting to get to her. The quietness was unnerving. No announcements, no distant rumble of an approaching train, just an oppressive silence that made the air feel heavier, almost suffocating. She glanced around, noticing how the station seemed to grow darker with each passing minute. Something wasn't right, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The uneasy feeling gnawed at her as the shadows lengthened, and the silence deepened, as if the station itself was holding its breath. As Casey sat on the bench, growing more anxious by the minute, a soft, mournful whistle suddenly echoed from the nearby tracks. It wasn't the sound of a modern train. This was older, sadder, like something from a different era. She stood up, looking around, but the tracks were empty, stretching endlessly into the distance with no sign of a train approaching. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A man in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform emerged from the shadows, his face partially obscured by the brim of his cap. He approached her slowly, his presence unsettling. "Miss," he said in a low, almost hypnotic voice, "your train is delayed, but I can guide you to a faster route." His words were smooth, but there was something off about him, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Despite her unease, Casey's curiosity and impatience won out. She followed the conductor as he led her to a set of narrow, steep stairs she hadn't noticed before. The steps seemed to descend into darkness, each one creaking underfoot. As they went deeper, the air grew thick and damp, and the flickering light barely illuminated the way. The conductor's voice took on a more eerie tone as he spoke of the station's history, mentioning trains that passed through and were never seen again. Casey's heart pounded, but she couldn't turn back now. She had to see where this path would lead. The train that screeched to a halt in front of Casey was far from what she expected. It was a decrepit, rusting locomotive, its windows shattered and its lights flickering erratically, casting eerie shadows across the platform. The metal groaned as the train settled, the sight of it sending a chill down her spine. This wasn't right. The doors creaked open, revealing an interior swallowed by darkness, with only faint outlines of seats visible in the gloom. As she peered inside, Casey's heart skipped a beat. The passengers, if they could be called that, were slumped in their seats, their faces pale and devoid of life. Their hollow, lifeless eyes stared blankly ahead. But as Casey stood frozen in place, each one slowly turned to face her, as if waiting for her to step aboard. The air grew thick, heavy with a sense of dread that made it hard to breathe. Casey hesitated, her instinct screaming at her to run, but the conductor's grip on her arm tightened, pulling her closer to the train. His face, once hidden in shadows, was now fully visible. A ghastly, rotting mask with empty eye sockets and a twisted grin that sent waves of terror through her. His voice, now dripping with malice, broke the oppressive silence. "This is your train, miss. Time to board." The stairs behind her seemed to vanish into darkness, cutting off any chance of escape. Casey's heart pounded in her chest as the conductor began to pull her toward the open doors. She was trapped, with nowhere to go but into the waiting nightmare. Casey's heart raced as she desperately tried to back away, but the conductor's grip was like iron, pulling her closer to the train. Panic surged through her as the passengers inside leaned forward, their hollow eyes locking onto her, drawing her in with an unnatural force. The train's doors began to close, the metal grinding shut, trapping her in this waking nightmare. She struggled, kicking and pulling against the conductor's hold, but he was too strong. His rotting face was inches from hers now, the stench of decay overwhelming as he forced her inside. Casey's screams echoed through the underground platform, but the world above was oblivious. With a final, echoing bang, the doors slammed shut, sealing her fate. The train jerked forward, its whistle a long, mournful wail that reverberated through the empty station. Casey's screams faded into silence as the train disappeared into the darkness, carrying her into an unknown abyss. Above, the station returned to its eerie stillness, the few remaining passengers unaware of the horror that had just unfolded below. The air felt heavier, charged with a lingering dread. Somewhere in the shadows, the lost conductor waited, ready to guide his next unsuspecting passenger to their doom. The suburban train station in Tokyo was impeccably clean and modern, a testament to the city's efficiency. But at this late hour, the platform was almost unnervingly quiet. The bright overhead lights cast long, sharp shadows across the ground, and only a few late-night commuters were scattered around, absorbed in their phones or staring vacantly into the distance. The air was cool and still, with the usual hum of the city fading into a muted background, leaving an eerie calm. Lucian, an exchange student from abroad, stood waiting for the last train of the night. After a long evening spent exploring the city, he was ready to head back to his dorm. Adjusting to life in Tokyo had been both exciting and challenging. The vibrant energy of the city was thrilling, but at times, he couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place, a stranger in a foreign land. As he stood there, his curiosity and love for the city's uniqueness mingled with a pang of homesickness. But tonight, something felt off. The usual background noise seemed strangely muted, almost as if the station itself was holding its breath. Lucian brushed off the unease as jet lag or maybe just the exhaustion of the day catching up with him. Still, the station's eerie stillness and the sharp contrast between its cleanliness and the growing sense of unease gnawed at him as he waited, the minutes stretching longer and longer. As Lucian stood on the platform, the quiet stretched on, broken only by the occasional rustle of paper or the tap of fingers on phone screens. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, he began to hear faint whispers drifting up from the tracks. He dismissed them as the wind or perhaps just his tired mind playing tricks on him. But the whispers persisted, soft and almost soothing. Yet there was something undeniably unsettling about them, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, until Lucian's name was clear among them. A shiver ran down his spine as he realized the voices were calling him, beckoning him. Confused and unnerved, he glanced around, searching for any sign that someone else had heard them. But the other commuters remained oblivious, lost in their own worlds, completely unaware of the growing terror that gripped him. The voices began to change, whispering secrets about Lucian's past, things no one else could possibly know. His childhood fears, his regrets, memories he'd buried deep. The revelations came in quick, sharp whispers, making him feel exposed and vulnerable. Paranoia crept in, and he felt as though the station itself was alive, watching him, waiting for him to make a move. Lucian tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just his imagination, but the whispers grew more insistent, urging him closer to the edge of the platform. The station, once peaceful, now felt menacing. The bright lights were too harsh, the shadows too deep. His heart pounded in his chest as he fought to maintain his composure, but the voices were relentless, tearing at the edges of his sanity, dragging him toward the darkness below. The whispers swelled around Lucian, their tone shifting from soft and coaxing to something urgent and threatening. They were no longer just calling his name. They were commanding him, pushing him toward the edge of the platform. His mind screamed at him to stay back, to resist, but the pull was overwhelming. The platform seemed to narrow, the once steady lights flickering as the whispers became a deafening roar in his ears. Lucian felt his body moving against his will, inching closer to the edge. Just as he teetered on the brink, a sudden, forceful shove from behind sent him sprawling forward. He hit the tracks hard, the breath knocked out of him. Dazed and terrified, he looked up, and his blood ran cold. Ghostly figures emerged from the shadows, pale, hollow-eyed spirits of those who had met their end here. Their hands were outstretched, their faces twisted in a terrible hunger. Panic surged through him as he tried to scramble back, but the cold, skeletal hands grabbed hold of him, pulling him down into the darkness. The train's headlights appeared in the distance, the rumble of the approaching engine echoing through the station. Lucian's heart pounded as he struggled, but the spirit's grip was unyielding. The whispers, now a cacophony of despair and malice, drowned out his screams as the train bore down on him. The last thing he felt was the cold embrace of the spirits, dragging him into oblivion as the train rushed past, leaving no trace of him behind. The train screeched into the station, its brakes howling in the silence of the night. The doors slid open with a hiss, and a few late-night commuters stepped off, their faces blank, unaware of the terror that had just unfolded. They moved with the tired rhythm of routine, oblivious to the fact that someone was missing. The platform, once filled with Lucian's presence, was now empty. He was gone, vanished without a trace. The station fell silent again, the oppressive stillness returning, but the whispers lingered in the air, faint but persistent, a chilling reminder of the horrors that lurked just out of sight. As the last commuter walked away, the lights on the platform flickered briefly, casting long, eerie shadows. The camera lingered on the empty platform, capturing the uneasy stillness that had returned. Slowly, it panned down to the tracks below, where the whispers continued, barely audible but unmistakable, weaving through the air like a ghostly echo. The scene held for a moment, the whispers growing fainter yet more sinister, before everything faded to black. The sense of unresolved dread hung in the air, as if the station itself was still watching, waiting patiently for its next unsuspecting victim. The underground metro station in Berlin was almost empty at this late hour, its modern design cloaked in a cold, unsettling stillness. The usual bustling energy was gone, replaced by dim lighting that cast long, distorted shadows across the platform. The sound of Harley's footsteps echoed off the tiled walls, each step amplifying the profound sense of isolation that hung in the air. Harley, a business professional on a work trip, was bone-tired after a long day of meetings. All she wanted was to catch the last train back to her hotel and collapse into bed. Practical and level-headed by nature, she wasn't easily rattled, but something about the station's eerie emptiness gnawed at her. The usual metro sounds, distant trains, muffled announcements, were conspicuously absent, replaced by an unnerving silence that pressed in from all sides. As Harley scanned the platform, she noticed that the station's architecture seemed to stretch on endlessly, longer than it should. The signs overhead were written in an old, unfamiliar script that made her pause. She shook her head, blaming her exhaustion for these strange perceptions, and tried to dismiss the growing unease as nothing more than the effects of a long, tiring day. As Harley stood on the platform, waiting for her train, she began to notice something strange. The platform seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, with no end in sight. Puzzled, she decided to walk a short distance to see if her tired mind was playing tricks on her. But the further she went, the more the station seemed to expand, the same flickering lights and unreadable signs repeating over and over, as if she were trapped in a loop. Her initial confusion quickly turned to unease. The station felt like it was warping around her, the architecture subtly shifting as if the walls were breathing. The lights flickered more intensely, casting shadows that danced along the edges of her vision. Then, faintly at first, she heard the distant echo of footsteps. Harley froze, glancing around, but the platform was still empty. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but she saw no one. Panic started to set in as she realized she was completely alone, with no escape in sight. Desperate, Harley pulled out her phone to call for help, but there was no signal. She shouted into the darkness, hoping someone would hear, but her voice only echoed back, mocking her isolation. The atmosphere grew more oppressive, the air thick with dread. Shadows began to creep along the walls, closing in on her, and the footsteps, once distant, now seemed to be right behind her. As Harley's anxiety reached a fever pitch, she noticed a faint light in the distance. A train was finally approaching. Relief washed over her, but it quickly turned to dread as the train drew nearer. The windows were smeared with handprints, desperate and chaotic, and the figures inside were grotesquely distorted, their faces twisted into silent, agonized screams. A chill ran down her spine. Something was terribly wrong. The train screeched to a halt in front of her, the sound grating and unnatural. The doors slid open with a menacing hiss, revealing a shadowy figure standing just inside. Its eyes were unnervingly wide, and a grotesque grin stretched across its face, splitting it into a nightmarish mask. It stepped onto the platform with deliberate, almost gleeful slowness, as if savoring the moment. Harley's instincts screamed at her to run, but terror had paralyzed her, rooting her to the spot. Then, with a sickening realization, she understood. The footsteps she had been hearing were never hers. They had belonged to the shadowy figure all along. The platform, once endless, now seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing her toward the waiting train. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and the lights flickered violently, casting the figure in an erratic strobe that made it seem to jitter and pulse unnaturally. She was trapped, with nowhere to go but into the darkness that beckoned from the open train doors. As the train screeched to a halt, Harley's body tensed, her instincts screaming for her to flee. But when she tried to back away, the shadowy figure moved faster, its grip like iron as it seized her arm. She fought, but it was futile. The figure's touch was cold and unyielding, dragging her closer to the open train doors. Her screams echoed in the empty station, but the darkness seemed to swallow the sound whole, leaving nothing but the oppressive silence behind. The passengers inside the train pressed against the windows, their faces twisted in grotesque, eager expressions, hands smeared against the glass. As the figure pulled her closer, the doors began to close, the sound of them sealing shut like a final, echoing clang that reverberated through her chest. The last thing Harley saw before being forced inside was the twisted grin of the shadowy figure, impossibly wide and filled with malice. The train lurched forward, speeding off into the abyss with Harley trapped inside. The endless platform, which had seemed to stretch on forever, now began to recede, the flickering lights fading into the distance until only darkness remained. The station returned to its eerie stillness, the echo of her screams long gone. There was no sign of Harley, no sign of the train, just the unsettling, endless platform, waiting in silence for its next victim.